Have you ever believed in something so firmly, so unquestionably, that it felt almost carved into stone until one moment shattered that certainty like fragile glass? And have you ever sensed a quiet insult floating in the air, one so subtle that people rarely speak of it, yet everyone seems to assume it's true? The kind of insult that doesn't shout, it whispers. Something like, Filipinos are nice, but they're not exactly world-class. Or, they're hard-working, but not at the level of top universities. Perhaps you've heard it too, tossed around casually in conversations, articles, institutions, as if the entire world signed off on this belief long ago. It was in one of those polished lecture rooms at Harvard, where the air itself feels heavy with prestige, when a respected professor repeated a line that carried that same old whisper. He said it with a calm academic tone, backed by slides, statistics, and the confidence of someone whose words shape global opinion. And yet, what he said struck like a micro-shock. Not loud, not scandalous, but insulting in its quiet certainty. The Philippines lacks true global academic rigor. Filipino excellence is contextual. Contextual. A word that sounds neutral, but cuts deeply when used in that setting. It lingered like a cold draft through a closed window, unnoticed by many but unmistakably sharp to anyone who understood what it meant. A nation reduced to an asterisk. Excellence demoted to footnote. A people praised for their smiles but doubted for their brilliance. And yet, here comes the strange twist. The man who said those words was about to confront the biggest mistake of his career. Because months later, in a place he never expected, he would see the truth with his own eyes. And those same eyes trained by decades of research, publications, and peer review, would fill with something he never expected: humility. His name was Dr. Jonathan Hale. An American, a senior cultural anthropologist widely considered one of the pillars of modern academic thinking on Southeast Asian identity. He had lectured in more than 40 countries. He had written books that shaped how the West saw Asia. And though he was respected, admired, even almost worshipped in academic circles, he carried within him a blind spot so massive that it had gone unchallenged for years. Dr. Hale did not hate the Philippines. In fact, he barely thought about it. To him, the Philippines was simply there. Warm people, smiling faces, colorful fiestas. A place his colleagues described as friendly but academically unremarkable. So when he stood in that Harvard lecture hall and repeated those assumptions, he didn't think he was belittling anyone. He thought he was stating fact. What he didn't know, what Harvard didn't know, was that he was about to meet someone who would change everything. A young Filipino researcher who had grown up far from the polished halls of elite universities. Someone shaped not by comfort, but by struggle. Someone whose story would quietly dismantle decades of academic arrogance without ever raising their voice. And it all began with a single message sent to Dr. Hale. A message he almost ignored. A message from the Philippines. The message that arrived in Dr. Hale's inbox was short, almost timid, written in careful English that carried the weight of someone who had rewritten every sentence twice. It came from a young Filipino researcher named Elijah Ramos, a man whose life had been shaped less by opportunity and more by the haunting pressure of survival. And though the message contained only a polite invitation, it carried an undertone Dr. Hale did not recognize at first, a quiet intensity born from years of fighting to be seen. Elijah had grown up in a community where classrooms flooded with every heavy rain, where street noise bled through tin roofs, where studying was a nightly negotiation between exhaustion and hope. His father had fallen ill when he was only 10. An illness left untreated for years because hospitals cost more than the family could dream of earning. His mother worked 3 jobs, drifting in and out of exhaustion so profound she sometimes fell asleep standing. Hunger was a familiar visitor. Fear was a constant neighbor. And yet, for reasons even Elijah didn't fully understand, he clung to learning with a fierceness that surprised his teachers. Books became his escape, his rebellion, his fragile lifeline. Still, no matter how hard he worked, the world seemed determined to remind him of his place. Grants denied, research proposals ignored, programs abroad rejecting him before reading beyond his surname. He once applied to a university in Japan only to receive an automated reply that the quota for international students had been filled, although he learned later that it hadn't. In Europe, he sent inquiries to a professor he admired, only to be advised to gain more Western exposure. In the United States, he almost made it into a summer research institute, but funding was suddenly reprioritized. Every door he knocked on seemed to close just when he reached it. Every path he chased turned into a dead end. Hope dimmed a little each time. But the Philippines, imperfect, chaotic, unpredictable, had always embraced him in ways the world didn't. When his father's illness worsened, it was a Filipino doctor from a Catholic volunteer hospital who sat by the family through the night. Praying in quiet whispers as if caring for Elijah's father was a sacred duty. When he almost dropped out of high school, it was a nun who handed him a scholarship form with a smile that carried more faith in him than he had in himself. And when he finally entered university in Manila, it wasn't prestige that kept him going. It was the warmth of classmates who shared their food, professors who encouraged him despite outdated equipment, and a community that believed brilliance was not owned by wealthy nations. Still, something inside him longed for recognition. Not for fame, not even for himself, but for his people. For the thousands of Filipinos underestimated not for lack of talent, but for lack of opportunity. This longing pushed him to follow Dr. Hale's work, to read every article, to study his theories, even when some stung. And so, when he finally gathered the courage to write that email, he wasn't reaching out to a giant. He was reaching out to a man who had unknowingly reduced his entire nation to a footnote. The message was simple. Sir, if you are open to it, I would like to invite you to review my research on Filipino cognitive resilience. Dr. Hale almost deleted it. Almost. Because there was something in the tone. Something steady but trembling, humble yet unyielding. That made him pause. One line in particular held him still, though he couldn't explain why. I believe you may have overlooked something about my people. Those words lingered with him for days. They scratched at the edges of his certainty, tugged gently at his pride, interrupted his sleep in ways he couldn't quite justify. Why would someone from so far away write with such conviction? Why did it feel as though Elijah wasn't trying to impress him, but challenge him? Dr. Hale didn't realize it yet, but the world he thought he understood was beginning to crack. And through those cracks, the Philippines was quietly stepping in. Days passed before Dr. Hale finally replied, and even then, his response was guarded, almost clinical. He asked for Elijah's research, expecting something raw, unpolished, perhaps earnest but lacking academic rigor. He had seen similar work from developing nations before. Bright minds limited by environment, constrained by resources. He thought he knew exactly what would arrive in his inbox. But when he opened Elijah's paper, an unexpected quiet filled the room. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like a held breath. The ideas were sharp, the logic precise, the insights startling in their depth. It wasn't just good, it was groundbreaking. In one section, Elijah described the Filipino mind as wired for resilience, not by choice, but by history, comparing the cultural endurance of Filipinos to cognitive elasticity under prolonged pressure. His arguments were supported with field data gathered from communities scarred by storms, displacement, poverty, and loss. yet somehow still overflowing with laughter, faith, and compassion. Dr. Hale read the entire paper without standing. Then he read it again. Something in him, something long calcified, shifted. He needed to see where this mind, this brilliance, had come from. And so, impulsive in a way that surprised even himself, he booked a flight to Manila. The heat hit him first. A humid, embracing warmth that wrapped around him like a welcome he hadn't earned. The airport buzzed with chaotic energy, children weaving through crowds, families shouting greetings, laughter mixing with announcements. It felt messy, alive, unfiltered. Nothing like the sterile calm of Cambridge. But what unsettled him most was something he couldn't name, a certain openness in the air, as though the country breathed with a soft heart that couldn't be hidden. Elijah waited for him near the exit, a little thinner than he appeared in his profile picture, wearing an old backpack and a shy smile that didn't quite match the force of his writing. He greeted Dr. Hale with a polite handshake, but his eyes held something deeper. Gratitude, nervousness, hope, all wrapped into one quiet gaze. They traveled through Manila together, weaving through traffic that moved like a living organism. Jeepneys painted with saints and angels rumbled past, street vendors waved with wide smiles, and strangers nodded at them as if acknowledging their journey. It was overwhelming for Dr. Hale, who had grown used to the cold anonymity of Western cities. People here looked at him directly, with curiosity but without judgment. At the hospital where Elijah had done much of his research, a nurse approached them. She was young, wearing a uniform slightly faded at the seams, but her smile radiated a warmth that felt almost medicinal. She recognized Elijah at once, thanking him for documenting their work with survivors of recent typhoons. Then she turned to Dr. Hale with a sincerity so gentle it caught him off guard. "You came a long way," she said. "Welcome, sir." It wasn't the words. It was the way she said them, as though welcoming someone into her home, not into a medical facility. He hadn't felt that kind of human sincerity in years. As they walked deeper into the corridors, he noticed something odd. Patients smiled at nurses even while in pain. Staff laughed with each other despite exhaustion. A small chapel stood in a corner, candles flickering beside handwritten prayers left by families. The air carried the scent of disinfectant, but beneath it, something else. Faith. It wasn't grand or loud, it was lived. And in that understated beauty, something inside Dr. Hale softened. He felt a strange, almost uncomfortable realization forming, a whisper contradicting the assumptions he'd carried his entire career, a question he wasn't yet ready to speak aloud. What if everything I believed about the Philippines was wrong? He didn't have the courage to say it yet. But the Philippines had already begun planting the answer in his heart. The days that followed unfolded with a softness Dr. Hale never anticipated. He walked through Manila and then through smaller communities outside the city, expecting to find proof of the limitations he had once taught so confidently at Harvard. Instead, he found layer after layer of humanity so profound it unsettled him. It wasn't because the Philippines was perfect, far from it. It was because the people here carried their imperfections with a kind of grace he had never witnessed. Elijah brought him to the community where he had grown up. The roads were narrow, the houses small, the roofs patched with whatever material could keep out the rain. Yet the moment Dr. Hale stepped out of the car, an elderly woman approached him with a bowl of hot arroz caldo, insisting he eat because he looked tired from the journey. Children peeked from doorways before running up to greet him, gripping his hands with unfiltered excitement. Their laughter rose like bright echoes bouncing across the alleyways. There was nothing polished or staged about it. It was simply life, unfolding without pretense. And then came a moment that stayed with him. A young father stood outside his home, holding his baby daughter. He offered Dr. Hale a seat, apologizing for the simplicity of their furniture, and spoke with a sincerity that reached deeper than words. He said, "Sir, thank you for believing in Elijah's work. People here, we don't always get seen, but he works so hard because he wants the world to know we are more than our struggles. More than our struggles." The phrase struck Dr. Hale with unexpected force. It was as though decades of academic assumptions collapsed under the weight of that simple truth. These people had every reason to break, but they didn't. They had every reason to be cynical, but they weren't. They carried faith not as a performance, but as a steady flame. They endured hardship without surrendering kindness, and in every corner of the Philippines he visited, he saw the same pattern: resilience braided with warmth, strength woven through humility. One afternoon, while observing a small church service in the community, he watched as families knelt on wooden floors worn smooth by years of prayer. Their voices rose in gentle harmony, singing hymns with eyes closed, hands held, hearts open. It was not the grand cathedral worship he had known in Europe. It was something quieter, deeper, more intimate. A kind of collective heartbeat. And as he stood in the back, unnoticed, something inside him cracked open. He whispered to himself, almost involuntarily, "I have never seen this anywhere else." It wasn't awe alone. It was conviction. A dawning understanding that everything he had assumed about the Philippines, its worth, its intellect, its contribution to the world, had been incomplete at best and prejudiced at worst. Elijah later took him to the university where he studied. The classrooms were modest, chalk dust clinging to old boards, stands of worn-out books leaning on each other like tired friends. But what fascinated him wasn't the facilities. It was the faces. Students hungry for knowledge, debating passionately, pushing themselves without the expectation of global praise. Their brilliance wasn't loud. It didn't need applause. It burned silently, stubbornly, like a candle refusing to die in the wind. Dr. Hale watched Elijah present his research to a small group of professors. His voice trembled only at the beginning, but as he spoke, his confidence grew. Dr. Hale saw in him something he had forgotten existed, a mind shaped by pain but sharpened by hope, a resilience that did not harden into cynicism but transformed into insight. And by the end of the presentation, the room fell into a hush that was not of politeness but of reverence. It was in that quiet that the full truth struck him, not as an academic conclusion, but as a deeply human one. The Philippines had restored something he didn't even realize he had lost. Faith. Not the religious kind, but the faith that people, no matter their circumstances, could rise above the limits imposed upon them. Faith that brilliance grows not only in polished halls, but also in places where hearts endure more than they should. Faith that a nation underestimated for so long held within it a strength the world had yet to fully understand. And for the first time in years, Dr. Hale felt a sting in his eyes. He turned away, embarrassed, but the emotion wouldn't let him go. "The Philippines," he whispered to himself, breath unsteady, "has restored my faith in humanity." He had not expected to say it. He had not expected to feel it. Yet every moment, every smile, every gesture of kindness kept pushing the truth toward him, unrelenting. He knew now that he could never return to Harvard the same man he once was. The country he had underestimated had changed him. And he wasn't ready for how deeply it would continue changing him still. In the days before he prepared to leave the Philippines, Dr. Hale found himself walking more slowly, observing more carefully, breathing more consciously. It was as if each step revealed something he didn't want to forget. The streets that once felt chaotic now felt alive. The faces that once blended into crowds now seemed filled with stories he wished he had time to hear. Even the humid air, heavy and warm, felt less like a discomfort, and more like an embrace he wasn't ready to step away from. On his last evening, Elijah brought him to the rooftop of a modest building overlooking the city. The skyline flickered with lights that danced between tall towers and humble homes, creating a mosaic of contrasts: wealth and poverty, hope and hardship, progress and struggle, all living together, unashamed of their coexistence. The sunset painted the sky with shades of gold and crimson, as if the heavens themselves were giving him a final lesson. Elijah stood quietly beside him. There was no speech prepared, no dramatic declaration, only the calm presence of someone who had unknowingly changed another man's life. Dr. Hale finally broke the silence. His voice was softer than usual, stripped of academic authority. "I understand now," he said. "Not everything, but enough to know I've been wrong." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He simply looked out over the city he had grown up in, the city that shaped him through pain and hope, and said, "Sir, we're not perfect, but we try. That's all we've ever done." Dr. Hale nodded slowly. "And the world has never given you credit for that." A quiet smile formed on Elijah's face. "Maybe one day. Maybe voices like yours can help." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request for validation. It was a statement born from dignity, gentle but unwavering. That night, as Dr. Hale returned to his small guest room, he opened his notebook for the first time since arriving. But instead of writing an academic analysis, he wrote a confession. A confession that began with a sentence he never thought he would put on paper. "The Philippines has taught me what resilience truly means." Words poured out of him, memories, faces, laughter, prayers, moments of unexpected tenderness. He wrote about the nurse who welcomed him as though he were family, the children who laughed freely despite having so little, the father who offered him a chair and spoke about being seen, the community that prayed with bittersweet hope, the students whose brilliance burned with quiet determination, Elijah, whose mind carried both the weight and the brilliance of a nation the world had underestimated. When he finished writing, he realized something profound. He did not come to the Philippines to validate a young researcher's work. He came to rediscover his own humanity. And he knew, in the deepest part of himself, that he could not let this understanding remain private. When he returned to Harvard, he stepped into the same lecture hall where he once repeated those assumptions that stung like quiet insults. But this time, he carried the Philippines with him. Not as a footnote, not as an anecdote, but as a revelation. His students noticed immediately that something in him had changed. His posture was humbler, his tone gentler, his eyes warmer. He began his lecture with a sentence that made the whole room still. "Months ago, I said something about the Philippines that I believed to be true. I now know that I was wrong. Very wrong." Gasps rippled across the auditorium. Professors shifted in their seats. A space that once felt like a fortress of certainty now opened into a moment of vulnerability. He continued, voice steady but filled with emotion. "If you want to understand resilience, faith, compassion, intellectual brilliance, you will not find the purest examples in the world's wealthiest nations. You will find them in the Philippines." Then he did something almost unheard of in Harvard's long, prideful history. He credited a young Filipino researcher for opening his eyes. He spoke Elijah's name. He spoke of Filipino strength, Filipino intelligence, Filipino humanity. And he did so with a conviction that left even the skeptics silent. After the lecture, one of his colleagues whispered, "Jonathan, this is going to change everything." He simply smiled and replied, "It already has." Because the truth had finally come into the light. The world had overlooked the Philippines for too long. Harvard had made its mistake. And now, one of its most respected professors was standing as proof that the Philippines was far more extraordinary than the world had ever allowed itself to believe. The message, his message, was simple and unshakable. In a turbulent world, the Philippines is living evidence that compassion, faith, and resilience still exist, and the world desperately needs what the Filipino spirit carries. And for the first time, Filipinos everywhere felt something they deserved long ago, not just recognition, not just praise, but honor, deep, rightful honor.